In Walmart's Who Newville, everyone ready their cart. Amazing Black Friday deals are about to start. Online and in the app, such great deals to explore. Everything you love from tech, toys, and more. The days to save and the ones to remember. It's only the 25th to the 30th of November. Set your alarms. Don't miss out. These deals are epic, without a doubt. The Who's are all ready, but are you? Walmart Black Friday deals await. Who knew?
Oh, Hilton stay, your beds are soft and cozy. No lumpy couch, no stiff futon, no shower line at crack of dawn. Oh, Hilton stay.
When you want holiday comfort you can count on, it matters where you stay. Enjoy comfortable rooms and friendly service when you stay with Hilton instead. Save up to 25% this season when you book with Hilton. Hilton for the stay. Terms apply.
Americans during the more consensual Eisenhower years of the 1950s had sort of more or less turned a blind eye, but it's becoming increasingly difficult to pretend, especially after the Bay of Pigs, 1961, that the US isn't doing these things using the CIA. Yes, it's partly the hypocrisy involved. It's partly the fact that there always has been this tradition of anti-imperialism, going back to the American Revolution, and the thought that throwing your weight around overseas, growing a sort of secretive foreign policy establishment, these things will ultimately boomerang on the US itself and threaten American democracy and Republican institutions.
Welcome to the SpyMasters podcast. My name is Antonia Senior and I'm your host. This week's guest is Hugh Wilford, talking about his brilliant book, CIA and Imperial History, which takes a novel and groundbreaking look at the history of the world's most famous intelligence agencies. It's a fantastic book, and I chose it as one of my picks of the year so far in a recent episode of my sister podcast, Aspects of History, so do have a listen to that one. Hugh is a professor of United States history at California State University and a leading expert on the history of the CIA. We have plenty more brilliant episodes coming up, including novelists Mel Nygate and Alec Marsh, and a new history of early modern spycraft by Nadine Ackerman and Pete Langman. So don't forget to follow SpyMasters wherever you get your podcasts. And now I'll hand you over to me, talking to Hugh Wilford about spies, empires, and the incredible characters who made the CIA. So Hugh, thank you so much for coming on the SpyMasters podcast. It's amazing to have you on.
Thank you, Antonio. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we're here to talk about the CIA and Imperial History, your recent book, which I absolutely loved. And it's a new look at the history of the CIA in one volume, but it has a kind of quite novel approach. Could you just talk to the listeners a little bit about the idea behind the book and the premise that you set out to achieve?
Sure. So I guess I was trying to sort of marry up intelligence history, and in particular the history of the CIA, with some sort of recent developments in the field of the history of American foreign relations and Cold War history. In particular, this notion that the Cold War was a sort of a continuation of imperial and colonial history in many ways. There was a landmark book by a Cold War historian called Arnie Westad, published in 2006, The Global Cold War, which sort of directed attention kind of away from Europe towards the global South, what was then called the Third World, and made the point, very compelling case, that the Cold War was largely fought there, and it had its greatest impacts there, really, not Europe, and it was experienced there really by the inhabitants of the global South, the decolonizing world, as a sort of continuation of Western, great power Western intervention in their societies and their lives. So it's really sort of it's thinking about the Cold War, as I say, as an imperial rivalry, and in that case, sort of rethinking the history of the CIA sort of through an imperial lens, because after all, the CIA important though its activities in Europe, one thinks of sort of classic spy novels and movies set in Berlin during the Cold War, but actually, most of the actual action, but that the Cold War was hottest in the global South, in the Third World. So I really wanted to think about what the CIA was doing there, sort of through that lens. I don't want to get too hung up on the notion of the US as empire necessarily. I just wanted, I was being sort of quite pragmatic. I just wanted to sort of just see what kind of insights, revelations would suggest themselves if I just approached it within that particular framework.
It's so interesting because just by shifting that lens a little bit, it gives a whole new perspective. Because if we go right from the beginning, because the book is both thematic and chronological, right from the beginning, from its formation, you talk about the kind of imperial legacy that's there from the outset, even within the minds of the people who create it. So there's this odd paradox right from the start that it's founded within a kind of atmosphere and rhetorical environment that's very anti-imperialist, and yet everybody involved in it is enmeshed in a kind of cultural imperialism that they find quite hard to escape.
Yes, that's describing it very well. Thank you. There is absolutely this paradox that the US sees itself as an anti-imperial power, founded in a revolution against an empire. Anti-imperialism is a very strong tradition in American political life, and also there was a lot of sort of specifically anti-European colonial thinking and feeling around in the early years of the CIA, which actually found its way into the CIA because a surprising number of early CIA officers were the children or the grandchildren of missionaries, and there's been a lot of interesting scholarship recently about how American, because after all, these were among some of the only Americans, right, with sort of experience of the Third World, and they figured really unexpectedly, sort of largely in the early history of the CIA, and they brought this kind of anti-colonialism into the agency with them. But at the same time, so there's that impulse, anti-imperial, anti-colonial, but the CIA is also the creation of a particular sort of group of men, it is largely men, mainly from the East Coast, mainly from sort of the Ivy League patrician class of Americans, which really dominated American politics and society in the mid 20th century. Their power subsequently reduced somewhat, but and these people very much had sort of, despite possibly being overtly anti-imperialist, actually have been exposed to a lot of sort of imperial cultural factors, as you say. They've been to New England prep schools, which some of which have been sort of consciously founded as kind of modeled after British public schools, and one in particular, the classic example of this is Groton, a school in rural Massachusetts, which have been founded by the splendidly named Endicott Peabody in the late 1800s, and he'd been educated at Cheltenham College and then Cambridge, and he very much wanted to imbue his pupils with the sort of ideals of Victorian imperial manhood and masculinity, and an incredible number of future first generation CIA officers went to Groton and similar schools, and they very much kind of brought those imperial values in, including just a love of imperial adventure. Rudyard Kipling was an absolutely sort of key person here. He really kind, and his novels of imperial romance, such as his spy novel Kim, they really sort of shaped the imagination of this early generation of CIA officers, and then T. Lawrence of Arabia is a sort of real life exemplar of these virtues as well, for as far as many were concerned. So that there is this there's this sort of competition between this anti-imperial, anti-colonial sort of missionary descended impulse on the one hand, and then this more kind of this sort of thirst for imperial adventure, manly imperial adventure on the other, and they're sort of at war in the early CIA. And what I think I show in my book is that the sort of the latter, the more imperial impulse, gradually wins out.
We shouldn't, though, doubt the sincerity of the anti-imperialist rhetoric, should we? I mean, these were sincerely held views, and they weren't. Whereas the kind of broader kind of imperial impulse, as you neatly call it, it was potentially something that they weren't even aware of themselves. So their thinking minds were wrapped up in the mission of anti-imperialism. Do you think, or am I being too generous?
I think that's absolutely right, and you're right to stress that. I mean, they weren't. I think very few of them, if possibly none of them, would have said they were imperialist. They were. They meant it when they said they were anti-imperial. The US was doing something different in the world from the old European colonial powers. Yet, at the same, so that they were sincere, they were hardworking, they were dedicated, often to the point almost of sort of self-destruction. I'm just reading their personal correspondence and memoirs. One is struck by just the crazy long hours that they were working, the risks they were taking, just traveling in often unsafe old military issue planes around the world. So I'm not sort of. I'm not kind of doubting their sincerity or even their idealism. It's just that even their sort of notions of service and self-sacrifice, these were to some extent imperial values. They were the sorts of values which Endicott Peabody had tried to inculcate, and which and British imperialists on whom he'd based his approach to education. So often empire and empires tend not to be cynical things, right? People go out into the world spreading their power, often with a sincere sense of mission, and that they are doing the right thing, not just by themselves in their own country, but by the inhabitants of the countries that they are colonizing. So I think this sort of this sincerity was, and it was felt by the Russians as well. This is something I was rereading just before talking to you. I was rereading the book I've already referred to, Westad's Global Cold War, and which it was really crucial in recasting the Cold War as a clash of empires. And he leads with this notion that these people it wasn't that they were professing democracy, etc., and then going, but really we're imperialists, and sort of sniggering to themselves. They were sincere and even idealistic.
And there's a sort of mirror image, isn't there, with the Soviet mission? Because again, a lot of the kind of Soviet rhetoric is around the early Soviet rhetoric is around anti-imperialism, and that's how they often present themselves to the people in the global south, as a kind of bulwark against imperialism. But actually it's another form of imperialism, because it's saying, here's a political system that we're going to sort of semi-impose upon you, and this is our sphere of influence, etc. So there's both sides in this global Cold War are kind of, there's a paradox between and a gap between their rhetoric and their actions, I would argue.
Absolutely, it's true. I mean, in my book is focused on the US side and the CIA in particular, but I don't deny for a moment that the Soviets were practicing imperialism as well, and sort of under the guise of anti-imperial values. Westad talks about it not just, it's different from old imperial rivalries in that it is to a great extent ideologically driven. It's a clash between sort of two different versions of modernity, one democratic and capitalist on the one hand, and the other communist and state-led.
But presumably the fact that it's a clash of those two clashing ideologies gives your early pioneers, particularly the ones with the romantic swagger, it gives them a kind of added impetus to their idealism, because they know they might not necessarily recognize what they're doing, but they can see what the other side are doing, maybe.
Yes, I think that's true, and anti-communism was an important factor driving these people. The sort of notion that they would be saving third world peoples from totalitarianism. So it definitely adds to this very powerful sense of mission which they often have when they go forth into the third world. But as I say, that's often not how it's perceived by the locals, and because these are regions of the world where empires have clashed before. Most recently the Russians and the British, in the so-called Great Game. I think it's there are just clear continuities from that early era, and that when CIA officers reach for sort of practical measures, for tactics to try and sort of execute this idealistic mission with which they've been charged, they do find themselves sort of using techniques similar to those of earlier imperial powers, whether they want to or not.
One of the things that I found absolutely fascinating was the kind of detail in the book that in some instances the CIA officers were inheriting the kind of material legacy of the decolonizing powers. So they'd be moving into literally the houses that were being vacated by the decolonizing powers, and taking on their servants and drinking off the same trays. And so you can see then from the point of view of the locals, what's different? I mean, the CIA, the American guys living in the house that the British guys just moved out of. How do you tell the difference?
Yes, exactly. They live in the same enclaves as European colonial officers. Their children often go to the same schools. As you say, they employ staffs of locals. It's all they just end up leading a pretty colonial way of life, even down to the way they dress. There's this moment I describe in one chapter, perhaps we'll get on to him, Edward Lansdale, who's he's very consciously anti-colonial and very much tries to sort of he couldn't his whole sort of personality couldn't be sort of more different from sort of stiff formal European colonial types, yet he ends up wearing very similar clothes when he's posted to Saigon to French colonial officers. He goes to the same tailor, and the tailor kind of makes up something which looks so it's this kind of material legacy which they just simply cannot entirely escape, even though they might consciously want to. It haunts them.
And what another thing I guess that I found very interesting was how often then they sort of get caught themselves on the horns of this paradox. So you talk a lot in your book about the growth of covert operations in the global south, and how in one sense, because the CIA was formed in an atmosphere of anti-imperialism, it had to be covert in its actions, because because the American public were anti-imperialist and they didn't want necessarily to believe that they were creating something that looked a bit empire-ish. So
absolutely. This question, why did the CIA become so important? Why did those initials sort of like become stamped on American popular culture and perceptions of the US within the Cold War Third World. It's less famous now, believe it or not, than it was back then. And for us, why did this secret intelligence agency become so important? And I think it's for these reasons you were just hinting at. The US has come to the fore as a great power, become the dominant global power at a time when empire is deeply unfashionable. The context is decolonization, and it cannot afford to look like an empire. It can't resort to sort of the overt measures that, say, the British did, Lord Palmerston talking about gunboat diplomacy. This wasn't really so much of an option for. This is why the invasion of Cuba that happens at the Bay of Pigs in 1961 is supposed to be a covert operation, although it all goes wrong. So the CIA, I think, achieves the sort of importance it did, and exceeds its original mission. Really, increasingly coming about covert action as much, if not more, than intelligence gathering and analysis, which is really its original brief, because the US is trying to sort of conceal its interventions, and as you also hinted, not just from foreign populations, but also somewhat from Americans at home, because our anti-imperialism is such a powerful tradition, which is kind of it's dormant, it's suppressed in the early years of the Cold War, but it really kind of comes roaring back in the 1960s and the 1970s, and it's at that point that the CIA sort of becomes anti-imperialist kind of student protesters and the New Left and the Black Panthers and so on, calling the US an empire, and they identify the CIA as the sort of the main agent of imperial power in the world. And I kind of see that to some extent as this kind of a clash between anti-imperialists and the sort of the kind of imperial generation of East Coast Ivy League CIA officers who founded the agency and are still in its leadership then.
I mean, I've been looking forward to talking to you so much that I feel like I've got straight into some of the thornier issues, and that maybe for some of our listeners who aren't quite as on top of the history of the CIA, we should backtrack a little bit, and we could start. So the obviously the CIA was founded in 1947, but it came from the bones of the OSS, which was the predecessor organization, which was during the war. I always find it fascinating that at the end of the war, they just decided that there was no need for intelligence anymore. Can you just talk us through that gap? Like, why after the end of the Second World War did the Americans decide they didn't need a foreign intelligence agency, and why 1947? Why did that decision get reversed?
Well, I think it's because of this sort of suspicion of big secret government in American culture, the idea that empires sort of come back to haunt you, that if you create a secretive foreign intelligence machinery, then eventually it will sort of, the language of the Gestapo was around in 1945. We don't want to create an American Gestapo. So that's why the OSS was wound down. This is the same pattern as had happened many times before in following US involvement in wars. There have been wartime intelligence agencies, but then they were sort of wound down after the hostilities has ceased. So I guess that the reason it comes into existence in 1947 is partly because relations with the Soviet Union are deteriorating rapidly, and America is sort of entering a new kind of state of war, Cold War, and therefore feel the need for this intelligence agency, but as they had during previous military conflicts. But it's also just because foreign policy makers are very conscious of the fact that it is now the big power in the world, and it can't just proceed to behave on the international platform in a state of ignorance. It needs to know what it's doing, what's going on overseas. And Harry Truman, the then president, who was kind of not a fan of big secretive government and positively disliked Bill Donovan, the chief of the OSS. Even he, although he's kind of resistant to the idea, comes around to the view that he needs experts capable of briefing him about foreign affairs, and thus he somewhat reluctantly agrees to the creation of the CIA in 1947.
And the original brief, as you say, was intelligence gathering. So
yes.
who are the movers and shakers at this stage? Who are the romantic adventurers that are kind of driving the culture of the early CIA?
Sure. Well, Donovan sort of kind of is the sort of the ghost at the feast, really. I mean, he's kind of hovering over the whole thing, but his European deputy Alan Dulles is very important, and Dulles is much more so actually than Donovan, is very much a sort of a leading member of this kind of East Coast WASPy Imperial Brotherhood, which is how one historian described them. This sort of this group of men, and Alan Dulles, brother of the future Secretary of State under Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s, John Foster Dulles, is a very powerful family, is probably the most sort of powerful, effective person sort of agitating for the creation of a permanent peacetime intelligence service. And although his real love is sort of covert action, actually not just observing the world and reporting on it, gathering intelligence, but actually carrying out secret covert operations to actually change and affect the world. And when he becomes director of Central Intelligence under Eisenhower, that really sort of accelerates the rise of covert action as probably more important mission for the CIA. I mean, there are people that argue about this, but it does, within the sort of institutional culture of the early CIA and the sort of politics of Washington, I think covert action, intervening to change governments, change unfriendly governments, intervening to shore up friendly governments, that becomes the CIA's chief mission under Dulles. And he sort of appoints under him, a whole bunch of other members of the Imperial Brotherhood. And I guess the main one who's featured in my own research and is a chapter of the book is sort of themed around him is Kermit Kim Roosevelt, grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, and a sort of a personal favorite of people like Alan Dulles. But there are others like him as well, including
Roosevelt,
cousins.
Kim,
yeah. I mean, Roosevelts are everywhere in the early CIA. There's an Archie Roosevelt, Cornelius Roosevelt. It's not just Kim.
With new, gentler scented Clorox disinfecting wipes, clean finally smells as good as it feels. On everything from lamps to ceiling fans. Even on your kid's toy shark. Oh, ouch. Clorox disinfecting wipes. Now available in crisp lemon. Find it on Amazon. Clorox. Clean feels good.
Meet the computer you can talk to. With Copilot on Windows, working, creating, and collaborating is as easy as talking. Got writer's block? Share your screen with Copilot Vision to help spark inspiration, and use Copilot Voice to have a conversation and brainstorm ideas. Or maybe you need some tech help. With Copilot Vision, Copilot sees what you see. Let Copilot talk you through step-by-step guidance so you can master new apps, games, and skills faster. Try now at windows.com/Copilot.
But Kim's a fascinating figure, and I think embodies quite a lot of what we've been talking about up till now. Can you tell us a little bit more about him?
Yeah, so as I said, he is a grandson of Theodore Roosevelt. He's educated at Groton. His father, also Kermit, is a sort of, he's kind of like an American version of a sort of Edwardian clubman. He's like something out of a sort of John Buchan novel. He goes off hunting and performing sort of romantic secret spy missions, and his son Kermit, or Kim as he's nicknamed in childhood, it's a name that sticks with him throughout his life after the Kipling hero. He sort of very much absorbs all of this, and I think his whole sort of career at the CIA is somewhat that of a sort of latter day imperial adventurer. I should say though that there is another aspect of Roosevelt which that's the better known side of him, the one I've just described, the sort of romantic adventurer. But something I realized as I read around and researched him was that he had also somewhat absorbed that sort of idealistic anti-colonial tradition as well, which features in the early CIA. He, during the war, while serving with OSS, he is posted in Cairo, and he meets there a number of descendants of America's missionary community in the Middle East. It's sort of headquartered, I guess, mainly in Beirut, and what he gets from them is this surprising amount of sympathy with the Arabs, with Arab struggle against European colonialism, desire for Arab independence, also actually opposition to the founding of the State of Israel as well. He's anti-Zionist, so he is best known. Perhaps we'll get onto this in a moment. He's best known for his role as the guy who commands the operation against Mohammad Mossadegh, the nationalist Iranian prime minister, whom was overthrown in 1953, I think largely at Roosevelt's personal instigation. So there is this, this is harking back to the sort of tension I was describing between this kind of anti-colonial impulse and then the sort of imperial, also the imperial legacy of the influence of European new imperialism. Roosevelt very much exemplifies this personally. He's pro-Arab, pro-Arab nationalism, yet he also, because of his upbringing, because of the sort of family legend of his grandfather and then his father, he's also personally compelled to go out and sort of carry out kind of spy adventures of the sort that becomes the 1953 Iran coup, and I think for me, Iran 1953 is the point when the sort of the imperial element within the sort of CIA's institutional DNA kind of takes over trumps that sort of missionary descended anti-colonial impulse.
Why do you think that is? Because it initially looks like it's a success, therefore everybody wants to sort of replicate it. Is it?
Yeah, no, that's right. It's so just briefly, the Mossadegh, this new nationalist Iranian prime minister, has nationalized the Iranian oil industry, which effectively means taking it away from British control. The British are furious. They hatch schemes to overthrow him. The Americans under Truman originally, because they go, well, we don't engage in colonial actions like this. They resist it, but then for various reasons, including actually, I think, Alan Dulles and Kim Roosevelt constantly pressing this, eventually sort of come on board with the British coup operation, and then the British are thrown out of Iran, and at that point the CIA takes over. And to cut quite a complicated story very short, in August 1953, a coup overthrows Mossadegh. On August 15th, there'd been a coup attempt which had sort of failed, and actually the CIA sort of operational team was on the point of being recalled, but Roosevelt sort of almost personally decides, no, we're going to try this again, and it comes to pass on August 19th. Mossadegh is overthrown, and then the Shah becomes like the most powerful player in Iranian politics, and that sort of the backdrop to the growing, increasingly repressive rule of the Shah, and then the 1979 Iranian Revolution. So, but nonetheless, those are the sort of long-term baleful consequences of the 1953 Iran coup. The immediate impacts of it is to delight Washington. Roosevelt goes back to he's sort of greeted personally like a conquering hero, and the likes of Alan Dulles always thought this, but his brother John Foster and the new President Dwight Eisenhower now think, oh, this is great. We can intervene to get rid of governments we don't like, just covertly. People, in the UN won't see this. American citizens won't have to see this. It's so much cheaper and more effective than sending in the Marines or what have you. And it's at this point, yes, that it becomes that the CIA instigated coup becomes the sort of Cold War Washington's preferred method of regime change.
Does Roosevelt himself have any kind of documented moral quandary around the fact that he's basically involved himself in taking out a nationalist? If he's quite pro-Arab nationalist, and he's quite any sense
that's a great question. It does seem a conflict, because a contradiction, because at the same time he's overthrowing Mossadegh, he rather surprisingly is backing Cairo, trying to strengthen the new nationalist anti-colonial revolutionary regime of Gamal Nasser. There's actually in the early, although Nasser sort of becomes a kind of a US sort of enemy and target initially after the Egyptian revolution of 1952, he is actually a sort of a darling of Washington, and Roosevelt and the CIA is trying to strengthen his new regime. So it seems to me that the contradiction here can be explained by the fact that Roosevelt is pro-Arab, but he isn't necessarily pro-Iranian. His attitudes towards Mossadegh and in particular and Iran in general seem to be sort of pretty kind of classic Orientalist European ones. Mossadegh he sees as this kind of this eccentric, unreliable, mercurial character who is setting Iran up for Soviet annexation and so on. So I think it's, although he feels personally sympathetic towards the Arabs, he doesn't towards the Iranians. But he subsequently backs away from covert action as the solution to all of America's foreign policy challenges. He is offered command of a coup operation in Guatemala the following year in 1954. He turns that down, and then he is quite after John Foster Dulles Nasser angers Dulles in various ways, and Dulles turns against him and wants the CIA to work against him and Arab nationalist leaders generally. And Roosevelt kind of goes along with that. He has to because he's been told to, but he's kind of unhappy with it. And then, yes, so he does. Does he ever express regret for Iran 1953? No, I don't think he does, because it's so much his great act, his sort of great act of imperial adventure, and like those of his father and grandfather. But he does caution against this turn towards always using the CIA as a method of covert intervention.
I mean, one of the things that your book brings home is quite how often the covert action was just a resounding failure, and yet so I mean, quite often it didn't work. And even, I mean, we'll talk about this sort of probably separately, but even the 1953 coup had massive problems down the line. But the ones, a lot of the time this stuff just looks like it was failing all the time, and yet there was still institutional belief that this was a good way to conduct American foreign policy. I'm not really sure how that.
Yeah, I mean, I get Iran and then Guatemala, which does work. The nationalist government of Jacobo Arbenz is overthrown in 1954. I think this does create this kind of notion of the CIA as a sort of magic bullet, and it's one that successive US presidents, although each for their own individual reasons, they don't necessarily always personally like the CIA, that it is just an awfully convenient tool to reach for. And yes, it does. A political scientist in a recent book sort of kind of ran the numbers on this and showed that covert intervention it succeeds much less often than overt intervention, sending in sending in the Marines. But nonetheless, I guess it still worked well enough going forward. Under Kennedy, clearly Cuba is a disaster, and it angers Kennedy personally because he's like, a new president at the time that happens, and it's very embarrassing to his administration, and it really sort of, makes U.S.-Soviet relations difficult for a while. But he often reaches for the CIA elsewhere in Central and South America. There's to the extent that the British are kind of they're almost amused by how these anti-imperialists are now sort of doing this repeatedly. And there's a quote from Harold Macmillan when he's the then British Prime Minister, and he says he enjoys getting the Americans to sort of constantly assert how they actually need to do this, and also back up British power even in the third world. So right, it isn't as effective as an overt intervention, and often it has disastrous long-term consequences for the countries concerned, which really should not be underestimated. But I guess just its cheapness, its deniability, crucially its deniability, constantly outweigh those considerations. So again, Richard Nixon in the late 60s and early 70s can't stand the CIA personally, thinks they're a bunch of snobby Ivy League eggheads, but he is very happy to use the agency when it suits him to do so. And most famously to destabilize the regime of Salvador Allende in Chile.
Right, but as you said earlier, just picking up on that again, then as we're moving into the 60s and 70s, though, there's a kind of backlash against this imperial adventurism, and partly, presumably, that backlash has to have something to do with how hypocritical it all seems, because you can't, there comes a point where you can't keep pretending that you're not an imperial entity, because this covert action is no longer that covert. People know it's happening, right? So presumably some of the backlash has to be a kind of charge of hypocrisy.
Yes, it does increasingly, right. Americans during the sort of the more consensual Eisenhower years of the 1950s had sort of more or less kind of turned a blind eye, but it's becoming increasingly difficult to pretend, especially after the Bay of Pigs, 1961, that the US isn't doing these things using the CIA. Yes, it's partly the hypocrisy involved. It's partly the fact that there always has been this tradition of anti-imperialism, going back to the American Revolution, and the thought that throwing your weight around overseas, growing a sort of secretive foreign policy establishment, these things will ultimately boomerang on the US itself and threaten American democracy and Republican institutions. I think it's also this kind of notion of empire as having a boomerang effect is kind of that's another sort of fairly important idea in the book, especially the second half. Part of that boomerang effect, ironically enough, is that as the US is sort of increasingly involved in the third world nationalism, anti-colonialism is kind of crossing back into US society, right? And is finding an audience, amongst young student protesters and black nationalists, the Black Panthers in particular, right? Who see the likes of Ho Chi Minh and other sort of third world resistance leaders, Che Guevara, as kind of allies against the American empire. So I think these are all reasons why eventually there is a sort of a rebellion against the US Cold War cause generally, and in particular the CIA during the 1960s, and you get the beginnings of sort of suddenly books and articles about being published, about critical ones, very few were published in the 50s, and those that were partly thanks to the personal influence of Alan Dulles and some of his lieutenants, favorable, but during the 1960s they start to turn critical, and you sort of have the backdrop to a kind of what becomes a sort of a nightmare for the CIA, the late 60s and 1970s. when large numbers of US citizens are opposing it and seeking to deprive it of some of its powers.
But how much difference does it actually make to them? I mean, don't they just? I mean, if you're kind of an institution like the CIA, don't you just dismiss the criticism from students as the kind of posturing of long-haired hippies? I mean, do you actually pay it any mind?
Well, you do, to the extent that it really, it starts to impact your reputation within Washington, because unlike when this is a way, the book is largely about sort of similarities and continuities between the CIA and European imperial intelligence services, but an important difference is the fact that the CIA is founded in sort of parliamentary debate, and its budget needs congressional approval, right? So you can't, if that also, so you need a somewhat supportive domestic environment. You need a Congress that is going to fund you and not curb your powers. And if those hippies eventually start influencing congressmen, as they do, right, there is this kind of anti-imperial tendency does grow, and it kind of goes mainstream in the 70s, against a backdrop of Watergate, etc. Right? There is the potential for domestic anti-imperial protests to really seriously impact your funding, your power, etc. So it does matter.
And I mean that the anti-CIA backlash is kind of part of a wider backlash, presumably, because I mean, as we talked about the Mossadegh coup earlier. Some of these, even their successes, are beginning to look like failures, right? Because in Iran, the long tail of that action has created quite a lot of anti-American sentiment, and that's happening all over the global south at this point. Can you just talk to me a little bit about that?
It is, and events like I mean, Chile 1973, the overthrow of Allende there which is seen as the doing of the CIA, somewhat somewhat actually inaccurately. There had been the CIA had been very active there, carrying out various kind of influence operations against Allende, but when his overthrow actually came in 1973, it was as much, if not more, the work of Chilean army officers, but nonetheless, this perception that the CIA has intervened everywhere and that this is actually domestic for the countries concerned, that really does gain widespread purchase during the 1970s. And also, to return to this notion of the imperial boomerang, because that so often is an important strand in American criticism, domestic US opposition to the agencies. It's not just what the agency is doing overseas, it's what it's perceived as doing at home. And with some justification, because during the 1960s, the CIA, partly unwillingly, it had been ordered to by the Johnson and then the Nixon White House, is conducting basically illegal surveillance operations against anti-imperial new leftists and Black Panthers. There's an operation called a counterintelligence operation called MH Chaos, which that comes out in the mid 1970s thanks to the investigative reporting of a journalist called Seymour Hersh, and that really is perceived as a major wrong by the CIA. Also, details have leaked out by this point as well of domestic influence operations, attempts to via CIA front operations to generate support for the agency and for US interventions overseas. So these are all contributing to this kind of perfect storm of criticism of the CIA, which really hits in the mid 1970s with a series of congressional investigations, in particular the Church Committee investigation, and quite a considerable reining in of the CIA at that point. Although, as I then go on to write about it, it's followed not long after by a sort of revival of the CIA during under Reagan during the 1980s.
Yeah, talk about that. So it for a while it looks like it's on the ropes, and then it comes out fighting. How much is that Reagan himself?
Yeah, no, I actually use that imagery. I think I write in the book about sort of round one to the CIA, round two to the anti-imperialist opposition, and it goes on like that. There's this sort of constant to and fro, and I guess having been, as you say, sort of backed onto the ropes in the 70s, the CIA kind of secretly at first, there are moves at Langley to sort of say, our PR is disastrous. We really need to address this, right? And especially a retired CIA officer called David Atlee Phillips sort of really tries to sort of have conduct this kind of refresh of the CIA's image, and then this effort really sort of ramps up in the 80s with the election of Ronald Reagan, who talks during his election campaign about the need to unleash the CIA because it had been sort of too reined in by the Church Committee and so on. And the 80s is another sort of a kind of covert action heyday, somewhat harks back to the 1950s, what the CIA described as the golden age of covert operations. William Casey, who's an OSS veteran, he's the director of Central Intelligence during the 80s, and he, in particularly in Central America, Nicaragua, were funding the Contras against the Sandinista, left-wing Sandinista government, he's kind of in the, although because of new congressional legislation, sort of prohibiting certain CIA actions, he has to kind of he is in the background. I kind of see these as basically CIA-led operations, but nonetheless he has to use kind of proxies and intermediaries, like most famously Oliver North at the NSC. But it is kind of it's a sort of revival of as I say, of the kind of Iran, Guatemala golden age of the 1950s.
And then we move into a period where the foreign intelligence gathering sort of becomes more assertive and the covert action takes more of a backseat more recently. Is that fair to say?
Somewhat, yeah, very recently. But I mean, during the war on terror, the 1990s is a fairly quiet era for the CIA. That there aren't the sort of banner, operations, and there aren't the sort of domestic rows that often go with those. But after 9/11, which is seen somewhat unfairly again as a massive intelligence failure for the CIA. Its covert powers are increased again, in the sort of the kind of emergency atmosphere, the immediate aftermath of 9/11, and it's the CIA that gets two major operations of the war on terror, drone warfare, targeted killing by drones. That the CIA runs that, and enhanced interrogation as well, rendition and so on, an enhanced interrogation run by the CIA, despite the fact it has next to no experience at doing that. But this is, suddenly in the sort of scramble that happens after 9/11, this is a responsibility that's given to the CIA. So those are, again, I'm constantly struck by how the CIA really is at the center of things, in the story of post World War II American foreign relations. For this supposedly secret agency, so much actually of the major events in US and world history kind of involve the CIA often in very important roles, including during the war on terror in these two particular sets of operations, which are seen to just and then I could talk, but you get the idea by now. I see the war on terror as having many echoes of earlier imperial eras. The fact that it takes place largely in sort of old imperial battlefields like Afghanistan, and many of the tactics and events of the war on terror era sort of do kind of basically duplicate those of earlier European colonial involvement in those regions.
Looking forward, I mean, specifically using your lens of America as colonial power and the CIA as an agency of that, arguably we're moving into a period where American hegemony no longer looks like such a undebatable fact, and that America's retreat from a kind of global power role, but we are beginning to see that potentially there is talk of end of empire rather than, the sunset on the American empire. So what does that mean in terms of the CIA's relationship with America's imperial ambitions, its future?
Sure. Yeah, and I should preface this response by saying I'm no futurologist. I'm not even much of a presentist. I'm always feel much more comfortable and knowledgeable talking about the historical past. But there's a kind of confluence of very strange factors right at the moment. The war on terror is kind of winding down, but it's still sort of going on. There's the rise of these peer or near peer competitors, Russia and China, echoing the Cold War. There's the very real prospect of another Trump presidency, and never, although I said earlier presidents had not gotten on with the CIA despite wanting to use it. Trump obviously takes that tendency to a whole different level. This extraordinary state of war which occurred between him and the intelligence community during his presidency, and the potential for that to repeat itself in even more sort of lurid form in the next few years. As for what the CIA will be doing, I think the lessons I sort of took away from studying its past were it should focus mainly on its original intelligence mission. I know Calder Walton has been a guest on your podcast before, and he paints a very alarming picture of Russian and Chinese sort of intelligence efforts and victories, and I think the CIA should really, rather than covert action, which is I argue, and I'm not unique in this, most other intelligence historians, I think, including Calder Walton, would argue that, CIA's record in terms of covert action is very checkered, and often, interventions like coups, etc., counterinsurgency often have unintended consequences. What the CIA needs to do is really not less of that. There are now 18 intelligence agencies. The covert powers of the US military have been greatly expanded in the last couple of decades. It seems to me that those operations should perhaps be housed elsewhere, so that the CIA can really concentrate on the sort of intelligence threats that Calder paints so alarmingly in his book, but also other things, other global existential crises, and I barely need to name those. The rise of AI, climate change, nuclear proliferation, and so on. In other words, I think that the CIA does still have an important role to play, but I think it should be in the realm of its founding mission, which is intelligence, rather than covert intervention. Less
adventurism, more protectionism, maybe.
Yes, yeah, I think so. I mean, Kim Roosevelt, had a great time in Tehran in 1953, but he, I don't. Did it help Iran or the US going forward? I don't think it did.
No, absolutely.
Less adventurism. Yeah.
Well, that is a fantastic note on which to end. Hugh, honestly, I can't recommend the book highly enough to our listeners. There's so much more in it that we didn't even begin to touch, but I can't obviously keep you here all night. So thank you so much for appearing on the show. Thank you.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thank you, Antonia.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to follow, tweet, spread the word so that we can keep bringing you more brilliant writers talking about spies. Don't miss an episode of the SpyMasters podcast.